I'm grateful, extremely grateful. I know I've said this a few times, but I'd like to really emphasize it that Martin and Filipe and Ricardo and our other speakers have been willing, under these extenuating circumstances, to prepare and share their research in this rather unconventional format, which I realize poses its own challenges, but also its own advantages, in that we are able to have so many more people with us than we would often generally have at a conference. So Felipe is, needs no, well, none of our speakers need any introduction, but nonetheless, I will say a few words. Felipe Silva is professor of philosophy and medieval philosophy at the University of Helsinki in Finland. I was just speaking of his hot off the press monograph on Robert Kilwardby with Oxford University Press in the Great Medieval Thinkers series. Felipe has published extensively and just concluded a major ERC, European Research Council project on the idea of rationality and perception, which super innovative and exciting project, which, if I understand correctly, is looking not only at the rationality of perception and thinking kind of outside the box about that, but also the role that reason plays in informing perception. And you've published a number of major edited volumes on this topic, one in 2014 on active perception in the history of philosophy, 2 volumes on the senses in the history of philosophy, many articles on key medieval thinkers from such a range. Is it 1250 to 1650, or
yes, yeah,
it's right, yeah. So really spanning such a length of time and numerous thinkers. So I was absolutely thrilled when you said that you were willing to talk about John Pecham in the area that you've been working on for a while, his theory of cognition. And I don't want to take any more of your time, so I'm going to turn it over to you and just ask everyone, like usual, to mute yourselves so that we don't have any conflict with what Felipe is saying, and do what you like with your video, leave it on, leave it off. And when we get to questions, I'll explain a little bit how we're going to proceed with those. But Felipe, go for it, and I will give you a little heads up at 35 minutes. So,
okay, great.
Welcome.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. I mean, it's really a pleasure to be here. I was hoping that we would have the meeting, of course, in London, city I greatly enjoy and always like to visit. But anyway, I think, like you were saying, this also allows people from other parts of the world actually to come and attend and participate in this event. So there are some benefits that come out of this sort of weird situation. So thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody for being here. So today, like I said, like you said, I'm going to talk about John Pecham. And for the paper, for the talk, I decided it's better just to limit to perception, because if I would also say something about intellectual cognition, then it would be actually too extensive, and there would be no hope of saying something interesting. And I hope I have a couple of interesting things to say. I'm going to be using 2 things. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint, just because I personally feel that it's always a bit difficult in this Zoom to always be following whatever the person is saying. So a couple of basic ideas. And I'm just going from time to time to be referring to the handout that Lydia circulates beforehand. So I'm not, if for most part of the cases, I'm not going to be referring to the handout, to specific quotations, but you will find in the handout the sort of the passages that I'm using to support a certain claim that I'm making about John Pecham. So John Pecham, as probably most of you know, he was born in Sussex. He studied in Paris between 1270 and 1274, in Paris and in Oxford. He's an important figure in the Franciscan order. He was a provincial minister of the Franciscan order in England, Then he was Archbishop of Canterbury, replacing Kilbarby when Kilbarby was promoted to the cardinalate. And if you just think about Pecham as being a teacher, he was really a teacher of quite many important figures. Matthew Vaca Sparta, Peter John Olivey, Witold Ford, Roger Marston, etc. But today I want to focus on his account of perception, and in particular, I want to focus about two completely or almost completely different descriptions of perception that he develops or in his works. One type of perception of description that I'm going to call psychological. I'm not in the Questiones de Anima and the Tractatus de Anima, and then a different sort of description that I'm also calling optical description or optical type of description of perception, that is focused on the mode of transmission of the sensory information from the object to the sense organs and then to the processing, internal processing powers. And this is especially found in the Perspectiva and the Perspectiva Communis. There is very little I'm going to hint at what connects the two sort of levels of description, but I will go by order to talk about the psychological level of description or type of description, and then to talk about the optical description of perception. In case people want to memorize, I think there are three numbers that are important for the optical description or optical type of description. That there are three levels of visual perception, that there are 8 conditions for veridical perception, and that the content of perception includes 22 visual intentions. But I will now focus on the first type of description. And it's interesting also to think that if we would want to spend some time focusing about the sources of the influence, it seems very clear that Pecham is operating with two different traditions in the philosophy of perception. So in the case of the psychological description, is of course being influenced by Augustine. Also in terms of faculty psychology, is certainly influenced by Avicenne and other authors. Whereas in the optical description, is mostly operating with a tradition of the perspectivist optics, so Alhazen and Vitello and possibly Bacon, although it's unclear how exactly the line or influence goes with respect to them both. But if we want to start with any account of perception, the first thing that we need sort of to address, if we define perception as a process by means of which we come to know objects and their properties in the external world, the starting point of any theory of perception has to be an account of how that information comes from the object and comes to be present to the cognitive subject. And of course, using a tradition that was inaugurated around this time, Pecham postulates the existence of species, so likenesses of sensible properties that exist in the external corporeal objects, and then they are transmitted via the medium and eventually received in the perceiver senses, like the color white. And the existence of these mediating entities, of course, is required because of the Aristotelian idea that there cannot be direct contact between the object that is being perceived and the perceiver. There has always to be a medium, and if there is a medium, there has to be a way that the information is transmitted from the object to the perceiver. That being the case, however, it raises the issue of those species need to have a kind of being that is appropriated to be transmitted to the medium and to be received in the senses. Now, one option in the period is to take the species as having a spiritual nature. And the requirements, I mean, these requirements of nobility or spirituality of the species, Pecham identifies as coming from Augustine, and he says the Augustinian principle that material things cannot bring an effect that is ontologically superior to them, so they can't bring an act of the soul, an act of sensation. So because of that, they have to be such that the effect they produce, the spiritual species, then they have a spiritual mode of being, and then it can come to be present to the senses. But this is not really a solution, because then we are just moving the problem of the ontological inferiority of the objects to the ontological issue of the species of being spiritual. And therefore, Pecham criticizes this view and says that, no, this is not possible. The species cannot be spiritual because a material object is not able to cause a spiritual, to produce a spiritual species. And he says, and you find, for instance, this in handout 3, that he says that it would be necessary, 3 and 4, that it has to be an infinite power necessary to transform something that is material into something that is spiritual. So if it is necessary, this infinite force to transform, if it is something spiritual, it can make something spiritual, but something material cannot bring about something that is spiritual. And therefore, he argues against this view that the species are spiritual, and instead argues that the species need to be corporeal. Now, what he means that they are corporeal, it doesn't mean that when the sense organ takes on the species, actually takes the sensible properties that the species represent, but he simply means with that, and you can see this in handout number 4, that the species are corporeal in the sense that they have the dimensions of the subject in which they are received, first in the medium and then in the corporeal sense organ. So the species are not spiritual, the species have to be corporeal, and they are corporeal because they have the dimensions of the subject in which they are received. On the other hand, also the receiver, the recipient, so the sense organs, also have to fulfill certain requirements for this reception. And they have to have certain material disposition in order to be precisely susceptible to receiving certain kinds of species. For instance, in the case of eyes, that they have to be watery and transparent in order to receive the sensible property that is their proper object, which in the case, of course, of the eyes is color, the species of color. But if Pecham until now has argued against the theory that the species are spiritual, has argued that the species have to be corporeal, the problem now seems to be that how is it possible that something that is corporeal, object, creating or producing something that is corporeal, a species, comes to produce an act of the soul, an act of sensation? And in fact, drafting a response to this challenge in very clear Augustinian terms, Pecham claims that perception is not the effect of an affection of the body, the reception of the sensible species in the sense organ, caused by an external object, but the soul actively tending to that affection in the body. And you have that in handout number 5, that passage in handout number 5. So, and he also says that the result of that affection of the body to which the soul attends means that the soul, qua visual power, transforms itself into the likeness of whatever affected the sense organ in accordance with, but not caused by, that affection. And you have this in handout number 6. And the idea or the appeal to the Augustinian clear terminology of the soul makes in itself and of itself the image of the object, you find also in handout number 7. And not only the soul is capable of making in itself and of itself, so of its own substance, that image of the thing causing an affection of the sense organ, he also takes that reception of the species in the sense organ is an occasion for this act of the soul self-assimilating to that affection in the body. And you have that passage very clear in handout number 8 and also in the PowerPoint. Those species are born out of itself, that is from the soul, from an exciting occasion, not from an impressing cause. Any other way would be contrary to Augustine, he remarks. So what Pecham is here doing is contrasting a passive causal model of perception, whereby the external object is the cause of the act of perception, to what we can call an active model associated with Augustine. He explicitly associates with Augustine, according to which actually perception consists of a two-stage process. The object issuing corporeal species that are received into corporeal sense organ, which excites the soul to make in itself an internal representation of that which is presented to the organ by the species. And you have this, I think, very clearly in handout number 9. And he continues to provide a number of passages from Augustine, trying precisely to show that we cannot have this sort of bottom-up causality whereby perception is the result of the efficient causality of objects. And you have a number of passages from 3 different and classic works of Augustine, the Musica, the Genesi ad Litteram, and the Trinitate, precisely by saying that the soul does not receive anything from the body. The image of a body that is found in the soul is produced by the soul itself. And the soul has this capacity to make making this internal representation. In a couple of places, actually uses the term fabricatio to refer precisely to this capacity of the soul to produce that image. And I think also particularly interesting idea is this idea that because there is this clear separation between the realm of the body and the realm of the soul, where the passivity aspect of perception is the reception in the sense organ of the corporeal species, and the activity part of perception is this activity of the soul, this capacity of the soul. Pecham actually goes on to say that we should not attribute the sensation, the act of sensation, to the composite, but rather the body has this function of cooperating to the soul, with the soul in this act of operation, to assist the soul with the reception of the corporeal species. But those species, the representation that is generated by the object, that representation does not enter the soul. So there is a clear distinction between what belongs to the realm of the body and, of course, what belongs to the realm of the soul. The passage is here, but you can also find it in handout number 10. So the first idea is really to say, because of course Pecham owes an explanation of an explanation for this activity of perception, and the first thing is to say, well, these are two completely distinct realms. The soul uses the body as an instrument for receiving information about the world, but the way that we perceive the world is not caused by that action. And the second principle, I mean, that explains the activity of the soul, is the idea that cognition is the most intimate act of the soul, and this principle of what we would call internal efficient cognitive activity is grounded on the assimilative capacity of the soul. So in several places refers to the soul as transformabilis and assimilabilis to the external cognized thing. And in fact, this is not just when he wants to talk and account for perception. He thinks that this capacity to assimilate itself, to transform itself, like those representations of the external thing, is essential to the definition of the soul. And you have here cited in the PowerPoint, but also the lattice in handout 11, the definition of the soul as an incorporeal substance that is potentially cognizant of all things and whose substance is transformable. Yes.
Can I just ask, do you think you could, I think some people are waiting, but I can't let them in.
Oh,
Sorry about that. I
yes.
know you've been
Yeah, no, that's fine.
focused.
How do I do that?
There should be just a list of participants. What if I take back the host first for just a second? And I'll let them,
Okay, I'm
or can
seeing
you see
here.
them? Perfect. Just,
Yeah.
you can just say admit all. And if you, sorry to distract you with that, but I think
No
it's
worries. No worries.
fantastic.
It allows me to collect my thoughts. I was going full steam ahead. So.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
There may be a few more
Coming.
straggling in. Sorry about that. I couldn't do it, but yeah. Okay, go for it.
Yeah.
Take
All
a
right. Oh, now I'm clicking in several things at the same time. Sorry. Yeah. Lydia, please let me know if I need to let some other people in. Okay. Okay. Good. So he talks about this sort of this assimilative capacity of the soul, which he thinks that is essential to the definition of the soul, right? And and he further continues this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but to talk about this, but he relates or connects this with, of course, the famous passage of Aristotle's De Anima, of the signet ring and the wax tablet. And in a couple of places, Pecham actually provides a sort of pretty idiosyncratic reading or interpretation of this by saying that the best way to understand this analogy is actually to say that the likeness of the shape of the seal comes to be in the wax, not due to the seal impressing itself to the wax, but to the wax having this capacity to assimilate itself to the shape of the ring. And you find a version of this in the handouts 12, and there are a couple of other places where actually Pecham appeals to this. Yes, I have to let some other people in.
José, I think, is waiting.
But now I can't see because I go to participants. Oh yes, admit. Yes, okay.
I'm sorry.
No, don't worry.
There he is. Cool.
Yeah?
Yeah, perfect. I think.
All right. So the interesting reading that Pecham provides of the seal and the wax, explaining it in this way that it is due to the capacity of the soul and the wax to be able to assimilate itself to the seal rather than the impressing action of the seal over the wax. And then I want to think about or to consider a bit this passage that I have here, and you also have in the Latin in handout number 13, which is a long passage, but I think it is interesting. Maybe I don't have to read it, but you can just go read it quickly. And the reason why I think this passage is particularly relevant is because I think of three things that it says here. Maybe I give you 1 minute to read the passage.
And in that minute, I think I'm going to reclaim the host and change the screen function so that everyone can share, and then you'll be able to share, and I will be able to admit people, and you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Okay.
Sorry about that. That's my bad.
So do I have to do something?
No, I don't think you have to do anything. Okay, so share screen. Okay, Bob, maybe you can help me because
yeah, I think now that you've unwisely made Filipe the host, you've got to make him give it up.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you. Sorry about Reclaim. Okay, I'm the host now. I'm going to let
Now go to security settings, and I
mhm.
think you can, that's where you can let everybody share their screen.
Allow participants to share screen. Okay, that's done.
You can also make someone a co-host.
Mm.
Okay.
Because now you are not seeing my PowerPoint anymore, right?
Exactly. Let me.
But you should be able to share now if it's been set properly.
Now?
There it goes.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Okay, so there
Cool.
are three things. So now I'm again claiming my rights as host and basically assume that you have had time to read the passage. But I think there are sort of three things that I want to consider in this passage. The first is that it makes it very clear that the soul's ability to react to an affection of the body and to produce that internal representation of the object, of the species pressed to the sense organ to the object, is the result of the soul's colligation to the body, relation to the body, which it perfects. And then there is an interesting bit here about when he uses the expression illustrante luce eterna. I'm not going to focus very much on these points. We could, of course. I read here that he just wants to say that there are two ways one can read this as having some sort of illumination, an act of illumination, assisting the soul doing this. The other, but I don't think we have to go there. We can just say that the soul is created in such a way that is capable of assimilating itself to whatever affects the body. And I'm taking this particular thing, this particular reading here. But the second interesting thing that I find is the way that he uses there the expression naturaliter, to express the way the soul makes the spiritual likeness out of the corporeal likeness in the organ. And the fact that in the very last bit of the passage, he connects this to the way that the variation of an angle of refraction follows the variation of an angle of incidence. And the reason why I think this is particularly interesting is that not only to allow us to then move on to the second sort of type of description, but because he really seems to think that this capacity of the soul to produce an internal representation is a sort of an automatic process by which the soul sort of just makes, in the same way that when we have a variation in the angle of incidence, then we have a variation in the angle of refraction. And what I mean here by being automatic is simply that the explanation why it is so is grounded on the nature of the entities involved. The soul is such that is able to do it, just in the same way as the rays, the visual rays behave in a certain way. So it's proper to them to behave in this particular way. Now, there is, of course, a lot of things that I think it would be interesting to discuss, and I have, of course, it's in the written version of the paper, but of course it can't be present in the talk. The two aspects of that I have mentioned very early on about the need for the body to meet certain requirements. First, it has to be appropriate to receive the soul, and second, it has to be appropriate to receive the acts of the soul. And then we would have a very long discussion about the way that the soul exercises its activity by means of the powers, and also the kind of structure or that the body needs to have in order to be able to perform the operations of the soul. But I'm not going to do this because also Ricardo is probably going to mention at least this appropriateness of the soul, of the body to receive the soul in his talk, I'm sure. But I want quickly then to go to what characterizes the optical, the second type of description of perception, the optical description. And I want to say two things to start with, is that this is going to be a very different way to approach and to describe perception than from what we have heard before. But I think there are two interesting elements that they have in common. The first is that although we accept again that there are species, which here you will call rays, that come from the object and are received in the sense organs, he wants also to make very clear, even at the optical description of perception, that those are not the cause of perception. And the second thing that I want to connect the two different descriptions is that the reception of those visual rays is not sufficient, is not enough for us to have an act of perception. And those are two sort of basic ideas, but that they are in both types of description. But we can come back to that in the Q&A section. So the first thing that we need to say about this optical description of perception is that in this description, Pecham is very much influenced by Alhazen and the tradition of perspectivist optics. And a couple of basic ideas. The first is that he, of course, defends an intromission account of visual experience, basically saying that there is some information that comes from the object and comes to be present in the perceiver. So we receive that information rather than sending somehow some sort of rays in order to capture the sensible properties of the objects. And he does that, like Alhazen had done before, because he's competing or he's challenging this extramission account of perception, by means of which, you know, there is a visual ray that issues from the eye, that goes to the object, and then brings back some information about objects. But this refusal of accepting an extramission is qualified, because he does admit that there are some sort of extramission of the visual rays, but they are not the primary conveyors of sensory information. They are just there for two reasons, he says. The first is that all corporeal things generate species. So if all corporeal things generate species, the eyes are also corporeal entities. Therefore, they also need to generate some sort of species, some sort of race. And the second reason is that he says vision is of the same kind in all animals. And we know that some kinds of animals, for instance, cats, and they issue some sort of visual rays. Therefore, if that applies to those animals, it has to apply to others. But this role of these emitted visual rays is just to prepare. They don't go to the object, they just go to the medium surrounding the eyes, and they are just there to prepare the medium by producing some sort of change to the incoming species. So this is the first idea. His account is an intromission account perception, but he accepts, like for instance, Bacon does before him, some sort of visual rays, but they don't go to the object, but they just assist or prepare or cooperate in the reception of the incoming species. The second idea, and you can find here this in well, actually not yet, that he says that, well, species are issued forth from all points of the surface of the eye and propagates in a continuous straight line. That is the most efficient way that something can produce an effect in something else in a straight line. And in order for these to be received, these species to be received appropriately in a perceiver, they need to meet 8 conditions, and those conditions are briefly announced there in the PowerPoint, but you can also find them in handout 19. So the existence of light, the existence of an appropriate distance between object and subject, that they stand opposite each other, that the object has a certain size, a certain quantity, that the medium has to be sort of rarefied, that is, it has to be transparent, the focus, of course, here is on visual perception, that the object has to be solid and denser than the medium, and that perception takes time, and that the eye are healthy. So once we have this sort of 8 requirement met, somewhere else he adds place in the perspectiva, but here he refers just to the existence of eight conditions. Now, one thing that I have been in the second part, that I've been sort of going back and forth is using ray and species sort of as synonymous. And in fact, it takes them, and you can see that in handout 20, that it clearly says that a ray is nothing but the rectilinear way the species propagate. So here, because precisely is working in the context of a different tradition, when he talks about rays and he talks about species, it just means exactly the same thing. The ray just refers to the way that the species actually propagates. But the question, of course, then needs to be answered is that if it is really so that the species are issues from all the points of the surface of an object, then how is it possible that our perception of that object is not completely confused and all mixed up, that we mix different parts of objects and different objects and so on? And it says that this is guaranteed by the existence of 2 sort of principles. The one is that there is only one incoming ray from each point of the object that is received in the eye perpendicular to the surface of the eye for 35 minutes. And that the perpendicular rays form a pyramid that has the apex at the center of the eye and the base on the visible surface of the object. So those 2 principles guarantees that we have a 1-to-1 correspondence between the species being received in the surface of the eye and as they are found in the different points of the object that we are perceiving. But in addition to this, Pecham also wants to say that visual perception cannot simply be the reception of those visual rays. There has to be more than meets the eye, literally. And in order us to be able to understand that, there are 2 things that are important. First, what is the content of perception, of what is that we perceive of an external material thing, and that he expands not only to color and to light, but he expands to 22 visual intentions that can be perceived by the eye and by sights. And those include, of course, light, color, but also distance, position, corporeity, shape, size, etc., ugliness, similarity, and diversity, and many others that come in addition to this. But those are sort of parasitical on these 22. So if we want to think, for instance, curvature or multitudes, those he also thinks that are properties that we can perceive by sight, but they can be reduced to one of these 22 properties. So for instance, curvature is reduced to shape, and multitude to number and so on. But, and this is the thing that I want to go, is that in order for us to be able to perceive those 22 visual intentions, then we actually need to have 3 levels of visual perception. And remember that when I started, I said that we need 3 numbers to understand Peckham's optical description of perception. The first is 3, the 3 stages of visual perception, the 8 conditions for veridical perception, and 22 visual intentions. Now, the first level of visual perception is just the perception of light and color, and that can be done simply by what he calls naked sense. But then we have the second level of visual perception, and that is done not only by sights alone, but by a power that he calls the virtus distinctiva, so the discriminative power or the distinctive power. And this comes sort of, the second level of visual perception comes sort of in two flavors, if you wish. The first is the perception of similarity, but in order for us to perceive similarity and dissimilarity, then we need to compare forms and discriminate between them so that we can say this shade of green and perceive that shade of blue. And then a different kind, a different flavor, that is when we apply knowledge that we already have, so species that we already have in memory, in order to identify and recognize the objects. And this also comes in two ways. A comparison between a species of a particular receiving the sense organ and a universal in memory, so that I can perceive this as being a human being or this being a stone, and the comparison between the species of a particular stored in memory and the particular thing currently present to the sense, so that I can say John is John or this is John. And you have these references in handout 22. Right. And then finally, we have the third level of visual perception that he calls persyllogismum, that requires the collation of the different particular intentions. So then we get to the 22 intentions, and especially it applies to the perception of distance and the perception of size. And that's what people have normally been talking as being keen to reasoning. And in fact, he uses this expression. Now, I know that I have used 40 minutes, but maybe I can go on for, say, some 5 or 7 more minutes. Okay, so now we have this sort of very complex picture of visual perception. So we just don't perceive color and light, but we perceive all these 22 visual intentions, or color and light, and then 20 further intentions. And then it's also very clear that this is not done just simply by sight, but it requires the operation of this virtus distinctiva, so this complex, this power that is capable of complex operations, that requires also going back and using information that we already have about that particular object or about that particular kind of object. And then we are able to identify or recognize that object as being the individual it is, or John is John, or being an instance of a kind. For instance, this is a human being, this is a stone. And the question now that we need to ask is, but if this power is capable of doing this, and it does it, this virtus distinctiva, it does it very swiftly. We don't understand that it takes place. We don't understand that we are sort of arguing, reasoning. And you see this, for instance, in passage 23 of the handout. The question that now arises is, what is the nature of this capacity? Can it still be a sort of sensory capacity, or is it a rational capacity? Or, as I think it is better to understand it, is a sensitive capacity, so it belongs to the sensitive part of the soul, but somehow it operates under the influence of reason, of a higher cognitive power. And I think it's interesting, for instance, that when Pecham refers to when we identify an individual as belonging to a kind, he says, and you have here in the PowerPoint, he actually says that for no visible object is recognized without a distinction of the visible intentions, or without a comparison or relation to the universal of known things previously abstracted from sensible things, ad universalia cognitorum prius a sensibilibus abstractibus. So it seems very clear that he is not just talking about something that looks like reason, but it seems really that he's talking about a power that either it's very heavily influenced by reason, or it has to somehow partake in reason. And there has been a long debate already in Alhazen, of course, in Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon clearly thinks that this capacity is a sensitive capacity because also other animals have it. I think Pecham, precisely because of this particular passage here, takes the thing to be a bit more complicated. And I think he tends to think that if it's not rational, it very much looks like being sort of a rational capacity, or in some operations, seems to be clearly influenced by reason. Now, this of course is problematic because in medieval faculty psychology, we don't really have hybrid powers, right? Powers that are both sensitive and rational. We have powers that are sensitive and then they can influence, being influenced by other powers. And the thing that I wanted to do, of course I'm not going to do it, was to sort of, it is very clear that it takes this idea of this particular power, this virtus distinctiva, operating in a rational-like manner or operating under the influence of reason from the perspectivist tradition. But what I wanted to say, to look, is whether, so that's no difficulty, right? But whether or not we can find this kind of rational interference in a power that is defined as being sensitive, in authors in this early Franciscan tradition, to which he certainly was well acquainted. I believe that there are a couple of passages, 2 in the Summa Lensis and 2 in the Summa de Anima of John of La Rochelle, where there is no talk of virtus distinctiva, but there is a talk of sensitive powers in certain conditions to operating under the command of reason. Of course, it's not completely new. I mean, if you just think about the function of the cogitative power, say in Aquinas, I mean, we have something that is very similar. But what I find interesting here is that whether we can find in the major adversary of Aquinas, actually also coming from a completely different sort of philosophical tradition, both the Franciscan tradition and then the perspectivist tradition, actually coming to a very sort of similar idea of this rational influence. Different power, different explanation, different influence, but something that looks like a sensitive power performing rational-like operations. And of course, there were a lot of other things that I wanted to say, but alas, there is no more time. So I think, yeah, and then I would like to provide you sort of with the passages, but then how I actually suggest to read those particular passages, and what actually it entails. Yeah, sort of a puzzle there. But maybe in the written version of the paper, this will be present. So thank you very much.